The hands of Layla Sterling trembled against the white fabric of the wedding dress she should never have worn. The mirror reflected eyes red from tears that refused to fall, while the sound of guests echoed from the ballroom below. In a few minutes, she would walk toward a man she didn't love, sealing a fate she hadn't chosen. The wind rattled the window like a whisper of freedom. Before we delve into this story, leave a comment with a rating from 1 to 10 and tell us what city you're tuning in from. May this moment bring reflection and emotion to your heart. The fabric of the wedding dress brushed against the cold marble floor as Layla Sterling walked through the endless corridors of the family mansion in Houston. Each step echoed like a hammer striking the coffin of her dreams, reverberating through silk-covered walls that had witnessed generations of Sterling women walking down the same hall toward the same inexorable destiny. Through arched windows, adorned with stained glass that filtered the light in amber and sapphire hues, the afternoon sun of Texas painted golden shadows on the walls of Carrara marble, but her heart was darker than the moonless nights of the vast expanses of the Sonoran desert. She had grown up amid silks imported from Milan and empty promises whispered in impeccable English and formal French, the daughter of Arthur Sterling, one of the most powerful and feared men in the state, whose tentacles of influence stretched from the oil fields of West Texas to the power brokers of Houston, passing through the corporate boards of London and New York. Her childhood had been woven with threads of unquestioning obedience and elegant silence, where every word was carefully measured in 3 languages, every gesture calculated to reflect the dignity and prestige of the Sterling lineage, every facial expression rehearsed to convey the composure expected of a daughter of the Texan elite. Her father always said, stroking her head with hands that moved billions of dollars daily, that she was the most precious jewel of the Sterling family, more valuable than the diamonds of Botswana or the emeralds of Colombia that adorned the family vaults. But jewels, no matter how precious, exist to be admired in silence and eventually strategically traded at the most opportune moment to expand empires and consolidate alliances. The marriage to Blake Harrison Montgomery had been arranged with the precision of a military operation and the delicacy of a diplomatic negotiation when she turned 18. The union had been discussed in rooms lined with English leather, where men in Armani suits drank fine tea in delicate porcelain cups while sketching the future of 2 families like generals planning a campaign. Blake, heir to an international oil company with operations extending from the Persian Gulf to the North Sea, passing through the fields of Venezuela and Kazakhstan, represented the perfect bridge between the traditional and the modern, between local prestige rooted in centuries of ancestral tradition and the global power that flowed through fiber optic cables and bank transfers. A graduate of Harvard Business School and Oxford, he spoke 6 languages fluently and possessed an impeccable reputation in international business circles. For Arthur Sterling, it was the culmination of years of meticulous strategic planning, the key that would open doors to yet unexplored European and Asian markets. For Layla, it was simply the death sentence for any chance to choose her own path, to discover who she could be if she were allowed to flourish beyond the expectations and limitations imposed by the surname she carried, like an invisible crown of thorns. In recent months, she had tried to convince herself with the silent despair of a prisoner accepting her cell that fate could be embraced with dignity, that perhaps love would come with time, like a plant slowly growing in barren soil, that filial obedience would bring an inner peace that would compensate for the absence of passion. She had attended lectures on how to be an exemplary wife, delivered by older women of the family, who spoke in reverent tones about personal sacrifice as the highest form of feminine nobility. She had participated in wedding planning sessions where every detail was carefully orchestrated to reflect not just the union of two people, but the strategic merger of two business empires. The flowers would be imported from the Netherlands, the champagne from France, the sweets from Lebanon, the musicians from Vienna, creating a spectacle that would be photographed for international magazines and discussed at diplomatic dinners for years. But on the eve of the big day, as she methodically packed her personal belongings for the new life that awaited her like a legal sentence, she found something hidden between the yellowed pages of a leather-bound volume of classic poetry that had belonged to her mother. Frances Sterling, something that would change the course of her story, like a sudden wind changing the direction of dunes in the desert. Her mother's letter was written in elegant script that Layla recognized immediately, each word formed with the care of someone who knew she was entrusting her deepest thoughts to paper. The words of Frances Sterling, written 25 years earlier on a sleepless night similar to the one Layla was experiencing, burned like desert embers in her mind. My dearest daughter, if you ever read this, know that I too tried to escape a marriage I didn't choose. On the eve of the ceremony, I packed some clothes, took the jewels my grandmother had left me, and reached the back door of the house. But fear paralyzed me at the last hour. Fear of the dishonor I would bring upon the family, fear of a world for which I hadn't been prepared, fear of discovering that perhaps I wasn't as brave as I imagined. I returned to my room, put on the wedding dress the next day, and for 23 years I lived a life I didn't choose. I don't completely regret it, for this life gave me you, who are my greatest joy. But I carry with me the eternal curiosity about who I might have been if I had found the courage to walk through that door. Do not let the same happen to you, my daughter. Freedom is worth more than all the security in the world, more than all the gold in our family's treasures. If you feel in your heart that this is not the right path, then find your own road, even if it leads through the most arid desert. Your mother who loves you beyond words, Frances. Now, dressed in white like a caged dove prepared for a ritualistic sacrifice, Layla felt the crushing weight of her mother's words pressing against her chest like an iron anchor. The sound of the Viennese orchestra, hired for the ceremony, began to play in the main ballroom, which had been transformed into a secular cathedral decorated with thousands of white and gold roses. A signal that in a few minutes she would be called to descend the marble staircase and surrender her life to a courteous and educated stranger who spoke to her in formal English and treated her with the distant politeness reserved for a valuable object acquired through negotiation. Her hands, covered by French lace gloves that had belonged to her great-grandmother, touched the small velvet pouch she had secretly prepared for weeks, identification documents she had managed to hide, small but valuable jewels she could easily trade for cash, a map of the region she had carefully memorized, and the keys to the smaller Mercedes hidden at the back of the family estate, away from the eyes of the security guards patrolling the main gates. Her heart pounded with a force she feared everyone downstairs could hear, a war drum announcing the rebellion about to erupt. Through the window of her room, adorned with silk curtains that cost more than many people earn in a year, she saw the last ray of sun disappear on the infinite desert horizon surrounding Houston, leaving the sky tinged with damask pink and Persian orange, colors that seemed to whisper promises of adventure and freedom. It was now or never. It was the choice between a safe but empty life or an uncertain but genuinely her own future. With precise and silent movements she had mentally rehearsed dozens of times, she exchanged the wedding dress, a Parisian haute couture creation that had cost the equivalent of a small house, for dark, practical clothes, jeans, a long-sleeved shirt, comfortable sneakers, a simple headscarf that would help her go unnoticed. Every gesture was a small rebellion against 23 years of conformity, every breath an affirmation that she was still her own master, still capable of writing her own destiny. when she finally opened the bedroom door. The hallway was empty, except for the dancing shadows created by the bohemian crystal chandeliers. Her barefoot steps on the cold marble were almost imperceptible, muffled by the authentic Persian rugs that covered the floor at regular intervals. The escape through the elaborately landscaped gardens was like navigating through a distorted dream, where every familiar element transformed into something strange and loaded with meaning. The fountains she had always found beautiful now seemed to be weeping for her departure. The rose bushes growing in perfect geometric patterns seemed to try to hold her with invisible thorns. The palm trees whispered secrets to the night wind. The flowers she had admired her whole life, fragrant jasmines, deep red roses, Dutch tulips, Thai orchids, seemed different under the silvery light of the crescent moon, as if they were bidding her farewell for the last time. The scent of jasmines mingled with the smell of freedom she inhaled for the first time, creating a fragrance she would never forget. When she finally reached the farthest corner of the property, where the Mercedes awaited her like a warhorse ready for battle, her hands trembled so much that it took 3 attempts to start the engine, each failed attempt increasing the risk of discovery. The road leading away from Houston stretched before her like a promise written in asphalt and moonlight, each mile a small victory against the fate others had planned for her. In the rearview mirror, the lights of the mansion gradually diminished until they became just a golden dot in the darkness, like a distant star belonging to a different universe. It was impossible not to think of the guests who in a few hours would discover her absence. Diplomats, businessmen, royalty from neighboring countries, all dressed in their finest attire, awaiting a ceremony that would never happen. She imagined her father's expression when he received the news, the cold fury that would replace initial concern, the urgent phone calls that would be made, the orders that would be given. But for the first time in years, Layla smiled, a trembling but genuine smile that transformed her face from a mask of obedience to an expression of authentic humanity. She drove for hours through the roads that cut through the Texas desert like veins, carrying blood through a gigantic, sleeping body, with no certain destination except the certainty that any place would be better than the golden cage she had left behind. The initial plan, formulated during weeks of secret planning, was to reach the Mexican border before dawn, where she had a college friend from her university days in Europe who could help her start a new life. Sarah Henderson had defied her own family years earlier to study human rights in London, and through carefully coded emails had promised to help Layla if she ever decided to follow a similar path. But fate, as always, had other plans written in the stars and sands of the desert. The first sign of trouble was a strange metallic noise coming from the engine, a sound she didn't recognize but intuitively knew wasn't normal. The Mercedes, a precision German machine that had cost the equivalent of a small hospital's annual budget, had never presented mechanical problems throughout her protected life. Then, dense white smoke began to pour from the hood like a genie escaping from a magic lamp, obscuring her vision and filling the air with a pungent chemical smell that made her cough. The car gradually lost power like a wounded animal struggling to keep going until it stopped completely in the middle of the desert road that stretched in a straight line until it disappeared into the infinite horizon. Around her, only golden sand dunes under a starry sky that seemed to mock her naivety with millions of cold, distant points of light. She tried to start the engine several times, turning the key with growing desperation while murmuring prayers she had learned in childhood. But the car was definitely dead, its mechanical life extinguished like a candle blown out by the desert wind. Her cell phone, a latest model iPhone that had always worked perfectly in the controlled environments of her previous life, couldn't find a signal in the electronic vastness of the desert. The reality of the situation began to settle in like fine sand, penetrating through clothes. She was alone, in the middle of nowhere, with only a small bottle of water, a few energy bars she had packed, and the growing understanding that she had exchanged one form of prison for another, potentially more deadly. The desert that during her escape had seemed a romantic symbol of freedom and adventure now revealed itself as a ruthless and indifferent adversary that recognized no differences between princesses and peasants. She began to walk, following the general direction of the road in the desperate hope of finding help, perhaps a gas station, a rancher's camp, another vehicle that could rescue her. But after an hour of walking under the stars that seemed to observe her with cold scientific curiosity, the paved road disappeared among the shifting dunes, swallowed by the sand as if it had never existed, and she realized with growing horror that she was lost in the most inhospitable desert of the American Southwest. The cold night wind of the desert cut through her clothes, which had been chosen for urban discretion, not for survival in Earth's most hostile environment, making her tremble like a dry leaf. The stars, so romantic when seen through the safe windows of her mansion, now seemed distant and indifferent witnesses to her growing despair, points of light that illuminated her situation without offering any real hope of salvation. Thirst came first, insidious as a serpent, beginning as a slight discomfort in her throat and evolving into an urgent need that dominated all other thoughts. Then came the exhaustion that turned her muscles to jelly. Her legs, accustomed to the soft Persian rugs and polished marble floors of the family mansion, were unprepared for the sand that treacherously gave way with each step, forcing her to use muscles she had never developed. When the sun rose on the horizon like a giant, relentless eye, painting the sky with colors of fire and blood, Layla understood with crystal clarity that she had exchanged a luxurious prison for another potentially deadly and perhaps infinitely crueler. She tried to continue walking during the first hours of the morning, using her headscarf to protect her head from the sun that was beginning to turn the desert into a natural oven. But the summer heat of the Texas desert is a force of nature that can break even the most resilient and experienced. Her vision began to blur, as if she were looking through water, her mouth becoming as dry as the very sand she walked on, each breath becoming a conscious effort. At some undefined point, when the sun was too high to be ignored and too low to offer hope that the day would end soon, her legs simply refused to take another step, and she collapsed among the golden dunes like an abandoned rag doll, convinced that she would die there, far from home, without anyone ever knowing that she had tried to be free, that she had chosen uncertain adventure instead of guaranteed but empty security. Consciousness came and went like waves of the distant sea she had only seen in photographs, periods of darkness alternating with moments of painful clarity where she perceived her situation in cruel detail. She dreamed of fresh water running over smooth stones, of her mother's musical voice singing ancient lullabies, of green gardens where she could run freely without fear of judgment or consequences. When she finally awoke from a period of unconsciousness that could have lasted minutes or hours, she didn't know how long she had been lying there like an offering to the relentless desert god. The sun was in a different position in the blue and merciless sky, and there was a shadow over her that hadn't existed before, a shadow that moved and had a human form. She opened her eyes slowly, fearing it was just another delusion caused by dehydration and heat, and saw a man's face watching her with an expression of genuine concern mixed with curiosity. Dark eyes like the deepest desert night, skin tanned by the sun of countless days outdoors, firm but gentle features that spoke of strength tempered with compassion. He wore a traditional head covering in white and brown fabric that protected his head from the sun, and an earthy-colored tunic that indicated he was a true desert dweller, not a city slicker dressed up for special occasions. For a moment, She thought she was dreaming of a romanticized version of the desert tales her nanny used to tell. "Thank goodness you're alive," he said in perfectly articulated English, his deep and melodious voice filled with genuine relief that couldn't be faked. "You are safe now. My name is Malachi, and I will take care of you." Layla tried to speak, but her throat was too dry to produce sound, as if it were lined with desert sand. He immediately understood her need, bringing a leather canteen to her cracked lips. The water was warm and had a slightly mineral taste that spoke of deep wells and ancient springs, but to her it was like drinking directly from the source of life, each sip restoring a bit of humanity the desert had tried to steal. Gradually, with the help of his firm and careful hands that spoke of strength used to protect rather than dominate, she managed to sit up, leaning against his arm. "Who are you?" she finally managed to ask, her voice still hoarse but functioning again, the words coming out in formal English she had learned from private tutors. "My name is Malachi Stone," he replied with the natural courtesy of someone accustomed to leading but who never forgot his humanity. "I am the leader of the Stone River community. My men found you when we were returning from an expedition to inspect new pastures for our herds. What is a woman like you doing alone in the most dangerous desert of the American Southwest?" The question was asked without judgment or accusation, just genuine curiosity mixed with concern for her safety. Layla looked around and saw 3 other men mounted on magnificent horses, keeping a respectful distance like guards who know when to give their leader privacy. All wore traditional Western attire and carried themselves with the natural dignity of desert nomads who know their place in the world. She could immediately perceive that she was before someone important, someone accustomed to being obeyed without question, but whose eyes showed the kindness of a true leader who understands that power comes with the responsibility to protect the most vulnerable. I got lost," was all she could say, technically true, although omitting the details that could complicate her situation even further. Malachi studied her face for a moment that seemed to stretch much longer than it actually lasted, as if he could read in the lines of her expression a story much more complex than she was telling. Then he nodded to his men with a gesture that communicated precise orders without the need for words. "We will take you to our camp," he said with the natural authority of someone accustomed to making life and death decisions. "You need medical care, proper food, rest in a safe place, and time to recover from this ordeal. Once you are better, we can discuss your situation and how to help you return to where you belong." The Stone River Community Camp was like a mirage that revealed itself to be wonderfully real, an oasis of organized human life in the seemingly infinite vastness of the desert. Traditional tents made of woven goat hair by the women of the community were arranged in a perfect circle that spoke of centuries of tradition and accumulated wisdom on how to live in harmony with Earth's most hostile environment. In the center of the circle, a natural spring of crystal-clear water bubbled among ancient stones, surrounded by palm trees that provided precious shade during the heat of the day. Women dressed in colorful dresses that contrasted vividly with the monochromatic desert environment cared for children who played among goats and camels grazing peacefully. The smell of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the aroma of roast lamb slowly cooking over a wood fire, and with aromatic spices coming from one of the larger tents, creating an olfactory symphony that spoke of hospitality and communal life. Layla was entrusted to the care of Ma'am Sadie, a middle-aged woman whose kind eyes shone with the wisdom of someone who had seen much of life, and whose firm and careful hands spoke of decades caring for the injured and needy. Without asking questions that might embarrass a foreigner in a vulnerable situation, she led her to a tent reserved exclusively for women, where she helped her wash with warm water perfumed with rose water, to change out of dirty and torn desert clothes into clean and comfortable garments. The simple cotton dress she was given, hand-woven in traditional geometric patterns, was infinitely more comfortable than all the imported silks and designer clothes she had ever worn in her previous life. "You are too young to be wandering alone in the desert," observed Mom Sadie, as she combed Layla's long dark hair with gentle maternal movements that brought tears to her eyes. "But your eyes speak of an ancient pain that goes beyond thirst and physical exhaustion. I won't ask questions now, because I know some stories can only be told when the heart is ready, when you are prepared, and only if you wish, perhaps you can share what brought you to us." For 3 full days, Layla remained at the camp as an honored guest, recovering her physical and emotional strength, while observing with growing fascination the simple but incredibly rich life of that community that functioned as a single organism. The children studied under an improvised tent that served as a school, where a young teacher named Omar tried to teach basic math and reading with limited resources but with unlimited enthusiasm. The women of the community worked together, weaving rugs in patterns passed down from mother to daughter for generations, their hands creating beauty as they talked and laughed, sharing stories that kept alive the collective memory of the community. The men cared for the herds of goats and camels that were the basis of the communal economy, and gathered at dusk in circles to discuss important community matters, always making decisions by consensus rather than imposition. It was a world completely different from what she knew, but there was a social and spiritual harmony there that she had never witnessed in her life of luxuries and empty social obligations. In her family's mansion, each person had a rigidly defined role in the social hierarchy, but here, although each person had specific responsibilities, they also had a voice in the decisions that affected the community. Even the children were listened to respectfully when they had something important to say, their viewpoints considered as valid contributions to the collective well-being. Malachi visited her twice a day, always accompanied by Ma'am Sadie or another older woman to maintain appearances and respect traditional customs that protected both men and women from malicious rumors. He inquired about her recovery with genuine concern, offered any help she might need, but never pressed for answers about her past or future intentions. There was something in his presence that deeply reassured her, perhaps the certainty that she was truly safe there, protected not only physically but also morally, or perhaps the way he looked at her without judgment, only with respectful curiosity and an interest that went beyond formal courtesy. On the 4th day of her recovery, while observing the children struggling to learn to read, with books so old and worn that the pages threatened to fall apart at the slightest touch, Layla made a decision that would change the course of her stay at the camp. She approached the young teacher, Omar, who heroically struggled to keep the attention of 12 children aged between 6 and 15, using only an improvised blackboard and a few textbooks that seemed to have survived several generations of students. She timidly offered her help, explaining that she had studied education in college and had experience with modern teaching techniques. Omar hesitated initially. She was an outsider, a woman of obviously noble origin who might not understand the specific needs of nomadic children, but eventually accepted gratefully when he saw how the children responded instantly to her infinite patience and creative teaching methods. Teaching proved to be a more transformative experience than she could ever have imagined. For the first time in her life, Layla felt she was doing something truly useful, something that stemmed from within her heart instead of being imposed by social obligations or family expectations. The small faces that lit up with genuine joy when they finally managed to read a whole word or solve a simple math problem were more gratifying than all the empty compliments she had ever received at countless high society parties. She discovered that she had a natural talent for explaining complex concepts simply, for finding creative ways to make learning interesting even with limited resources, for inspiring confidence in children who had been convinced they weren't intelligent enough for formal education. It was during these teaching sessions that became the highlight of her days that Malachi often appeared silently. He would stand at the entrance of the school tent, observing in respectful silence as she worked with the children, his face expressing a mixture of admiration and something deeper that she couldn't fully identify. She didn't initially notice his presence, completely absorbed in the work of teaching, until some peripheral movement or comment from the children made her turn and meet his dark eyes, observing her with an intensity that made her blush. On these occasions, both felt something indefinable but undeniable pass between them. A mutual recognition that went far beyond words, a spiritual connection that transcended differences in social origin and lifestyle. One particularly starry night, after the children had gone to sleep and the camp had settled into the respectful silence that precedes slumber, Malachi found Layla sitting alone near the spring, contemplating the constellations that shone with impossible clarity in the clear desert sky. The running water created a soft melody that mingled with the distant sound of the night wind moving the tents and the occasional bleating of a camel or goat. He approached slowly, his step soft on the sand, almost inaudible, as if he didn't want to interrupt her silent communion with the night. "May I sit beside you?" he asked, with the formal courtesy that always characterized their public interactions. She nodded affirmatively, feeling an inexplicable acceleration of her heart rate just from his proximity, and they remained in contemplative silence for several minutes, just listening to the soft symphony of desert night sounds and allowing the tranquility of the moment to wash away the day's tensions and worries. "You teach with a natural gift that is rarely seen," he said finally, his low voice carrying a genuine admiration that made her feel a pride she had never experienced before. "The children speak of you with true affection. They say you make letters come alive, that you turn numbers into stories, that you make learning an adventure instead of an obligation." Layla smiled for the first time since her arrival at the camp, a smile that lit up her face and made Malachi realize for the first time how truly beautiful she was when the mask of sadness and fear dissolved. "It's strange to discover this about myself, but I feel more genuinely myself here, teaching these wonderful children, than at any other moment in my entire previous life. It's as if I've finally found my true purpose." "And what was your previous life?" The question was asked with the delicacy of someone who understands that some stories are painful to tell, but Layla felt that the time had finally come for at least an edited version of the truth. She looked at him for a long moment, studying the features of his face illuminated by the silvery starlight, trying to decipher if she could truly trust this man who had saved and protected her without asking for anything in return. Malachi's dark eyes were serious but kind, and there was something in his demeanor, the way he kept a respectful distance, how he spoke to her as an equal despite his position of unquestionable authority, how he seemed genuinely interested in her answer instead of merely curious, that made her make a decision that would change everything between them. "I ran away from an arranged marriage," she said simply, the words coming out in a whisper that carried the weight of months of silent anguish. "On the night before the ceremony, I realized I couldn't spend the rest of my life pretending to be happy in a union that had been negotiated like a business transaction." Malachi showed no surprise or disapproval at the confession that could have scandalized many men of his generation and social standing. He merely nodded slightly, as if the information confirmed suspicions he had already developed based on careful observation of her behavior and mannerisms. "Why did you run?" he asked, his voice carrying genuine interest instead of moral judgment. "Because no one ever asked me what I wanted for my own life," she replied, feeling the emotions she had suppressed for so long finally finding a voice. "Because my entire existence was planned by other people, as if I were a piece in a chess game instead of a human being with my own dreams and desires. Because I discovered that." Her voice failed for a moment as she struggled to find the right words. "Because I realized that I cannot love out of obligation. I cannot fake feelings that don't exist. I cannot spend decades living a lie just to satisfy social expectations." "And now, what do you intend to do with this freedom you've won with so much sacrifice?" The question was asked with genuine curiosity about her future plans. It was a question that had tormented her during sleepless hours since she arrived at the camp, keeping her awake, contemplating possibilities ranging from practical realism to impossible fantasies. Initially, the plan had been simple: continue her journey as soon as she fully recovered, head to the Mexican border, find her friend Sarah, and start a new life somewhere no one knew her real name. But the longer she spent at the camp, observing the harmonious communal life and discovering talents she never knew she possessed, the harder it became to imagine leaving to face uncertainty and loneliness again. "Honestly, I don't know," she admitted with a vulnerability she rarely allowed others to see. "I can't go back to my previous life because that would mean accepting everything I rebelled against. But I also don't know where to go or how to build a completely new existence from scratch." Malachi remained silent for a long moment, as if he were carefully weighing not only his next words, but also the implications of any offer he might make. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the seriousness of someone who completely understands the weight of his words. "You could consider staying with us," he said carefully, "at least temporarily while you decide your next step. Our school desperately needs a qualified teacher, and the children would benefit immensely from your knowledge and teaching methods. It would be a mutually beneficial situation." Layla's heart accelerated significantly, but she tried to keep her voice calm so as not to betray the intensity of her emotional reaction to the suggestion. "Would your community accept an outsider living permanently among you? Wouldn't it be problematic to have a woman of unknown origin teaching the children?" "They have already accepted you as part of our community," he replied with a soft smile that completely transformed his stern expression. "Haven't you noticed how the women naturally include you in their conversations and daily activities? How the men respectfully nod and greet you when you pass? How the children run to meet you every morning? You are no longer a curious outsider, Layla. You have become one of us through your actions and your character, not through birth or blood." It was the first time he had spoken her name aloud in a private conversation, and the sound coming from his lips with a desert accent made something deep stir within her. A mix of contentment and yearning that both frightened and fascinated her simultaneously, as if a dormant part of her soul was awakening for the first time. In the following days, Layla established a daily routine that filled her with more satisfaction than any activity in her previous life. She awoke with the first rays of sun, painting the tents golden to teach the younger children, using modern pedagogical techniques adapted to limited resources, but applying them with infinite creativity. She spent afternoons helping the women with their crafts while learning about ancient traditions and listening to stories that connected the present with centuries of accumulated wisdom. Evenings were dedicated to writing detailed lesson plans by the soft light of oil lamps, preparing handmade teaching materials that compensated for the lack of commercial resources with imagination and dedication. It was a simple life compared to the luxuries of her privileged upbringing, but it was filled with genuine purpose and emotional satisfaction in a way her previous existence had never provided. Each day brought small victories: a child who finally mastered reading, another who discovered a talent for math, a young person who developed an interest in geography through stories about distant places. These were modest achievements by high society standards, but infinitely more meaningful than any empty praise she had ever received at diplomatic dinners or social events. Maliki also established his own routine that always included moments of respectful interaction with her. He appeared at the school every morning to briefly observe the lessons, not as a suspicious supervisor, but as a leader interested in the educational well-being of his children. During the day, he occasionally appeared to offer help when she needed specific materials or had logistical difficulties, always finding creative solutions to practical problems. And every night, after community responsibilities were fulfilled, he came to talk with her near the spring, in conversations that became the moment both most eagerly awaited, though neither ever openly admitted the extent of their anticipation. These nightly conversations covered an impressive range of topics that gradually revealed the intellectual depth of both. They spoke about the complex history of the Stone River community, which dated back centuries of migration across the American Southwest. They discussed the practical and philosophical challenges of maintaining ancestral traditions in a modern world that changed at the speed of light. They shared dreams about expanding educational opportunities for children from other nomadic communities who still lived isolated from formal education. Maliki revealed himself to be a deeply intelligent man who had studied administration and international relations at top European universities before voluntarily returning to lead his people. He had a balanced, progressive vision that deeply respected the past, but embraced necessary changes to ensure the survival and prosperity of his community. Why did you decide to return to the desert after experiencing life in the big European cities? Layla asked one night when the moon was particularly bright, casting silvery shadows between the tents. "Because this is my true place in the universe," he replied without hesitation, looking at the tents where his people slept peacefully under the stars. "They depend on me for leadership and protection, and I depend on them for purpose and meaning. There are sacred responsibilities that come with the privilege of being born into certain social positions, obligations that transcend personal desires. Don't you understand that kind of commitment?" The question struck deep in Layla's heart because it forced her to reconsider her own situation from a different perspective. She had always seen her privileged social position only as a luxurious prison that limited her choices, but Maliki managed to see the same kind of inherited obligation as a source of high purpose and personal fulfillment. "Perhaps I understand better now than before," and she admitted carefully. "But what if you never had a real choice? What if your entire life was decided by other people without any consultation of your personal desires or dreams?" "Then I would find a way to consciously transform what was imposed on me into something I choose to embrace voluntarily," he said, looking directly into her eyes with an intensity that made her feel as if he could see directly into her soul. "Exactly as you are doing now, transforming flight and rejection into voluntary service and personal growth." It was precisely at that moment of crystal clarity that Layla definitively understood she had fallen deeply and irrevocably in love with Maliki. It wasn't a dramatic revelation accompanied by music and fireworks, but a soft, inevitable certainty that settled in her heart like the sun gradually rising on the eastern horizon, illuminating landscapes that had always been there, but that only now could be seen clearly. Here was a man who intuitively understood both the weight of responsibility and the value of personal freedom, who could lead hundreds of people without ever dominating or diminishing those around him, who respected her as an intellectual and moral equal despite the obvious differences in social origin and life experience. But along with this liberating understanding also came the paralyzing fear of practical implications. What she was feeling seemed impossible for countless reasons that accumulated like insurmountable obstacles. She was technically a fugitive from a powerful family that was certainly looking for her. He was a respected leader with responsibilities that extended far beyond his personal feelings. She came from a world of urban privilege and international sophistication. He was deeply rooted in traditional desert life. Most importantly, she wasn't sure if what she occasionally perceived in his eyes was just natural kindness and desert hospitality, or something deeper and more personal that mirrored her own growing feelings. The answer to that crucial question came a week later, completely unexpectedly and potentially disastrously. Itinerant traders arrived at the camp, bringing essential supplies the community couldn't produce internally, and, more dangerously, news from the outside world that Layla had managed to temporarily forget. Among the English-language newspapers the traders brought to entertain the literate members of the community during the long nights, Maliki found a page that made him visibly pale. Layla's professional photo was emblazoned on the front page of the Houston Chronicle, accompanied by a headline that read, "Daughter of business mogul mysteriously disappears on eve of important wedding." Layla was in the middle of a particularly productive teaching session, helping a 10-year-old girl decipher a complicated passage from a history book, when she saw Maliki appear at the entrance of the school tent with an expression that immediately alerted her to serious trouble. With an almost imperceptible gesture that communicated urgency without alarming the children, he asked her to step outside to talk privately. As soon as they were far enough from the children not to be overheard, he carefully unfolded the newspaper and showed her the problematic page. "Layla Sterling," he read in a low, controlled voice, translating the headline. "Daughter of business magnate Arthur Sterling, mysteriously disappeared on the eve of her wedding to prominent businessman Blake Harrison Montgomery. The family offers a substantial reward for information leading to her safe return and is cooperating fully with authorities in the disappearance investigation." The silence that followed the reading was absolutely deafening, laden with implications that instantly changed the entire dynamic of her situation. Layla felt as if the solid ground of the desert was literally disappearing beneath her feet, leaving her falling into an abyss of consequences she had managed to ignore during her physical and emotional recovery. All the half-truths and careful omissions she had told were there exposed in black ink on white paper, impossible to deny or minimize. "Did you know exactly who I was from the beginning?" "And," she asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear, shame, and uncertainty about how this revelation would change everything between them. "I suspected you came from a very important and prominent family," he admitted with the direct honesty that always characterized their interactions. "Your refined way of speaking perfect English, your extensive knowledge of history and literature, your obviously expensive quality clothes, even after days in the desert. Everything indicated high-level, noble origin. But I had no idea that you were specifically the daughter of Arthur Sterling, one of the most powerful and well-connected men in the entire state." Her father's name, spoken aloud by Maliki, sounded like a legal sentence, carrying all the weight of reputation, power, political influence, and capacity for revenge that Arthur Sterling represented. He wasn't just wealthy and socially prominent. He was a man who never, in his decades-long career of building a business empire, had forgiven a public affront or allowed challenges to his authority to go without appropriate response. His daughter's disappearance on the eve of a wedding that had been publicly announced in international business circles was exactly the kind of humiliation he would consider a personal declaration of war. "Are you going to turn me over to the authorities?" The question escaped as a whisper laden with all the fear she had tried to suppress, but also with a resigned acceptance that perhaps this was the only moral option available to a man in his position. Malachi looked at her for a moment that seemed to stretch indefinitely, his dark eyes studying her face as if memorizing every detail, then methodically tore the newspaper into small uniform pieces. As the paper fragments flew in the constant desert wind like confetti, celebrating an unexpected victory, he said with absolute firmness, "What newspaper? I didn't see any newspaper." The gratitude Layla felt was so intense and overwhelming that tears finally came. Tears she had held back and suppressed since the night of her escape, since the terrifying awakening in the desert, since the moment she realized she had fallen in love with a man who represented everything she valued most, but could never realistically have for herself. "Why would you risk your reputation and the safety of your community for my sake?" she managed to ask between sobs that released months of accumulated emotional tension. "Because you are no longer just Layla Sterling, Arthur's daughter," he replied, approaching carefully and gently touching her face to wipe away the uncontrolled tears. "You are Layla, the extraordinary teacher who made Ethan Riley read his first complete sentence after months of trying. You are Layla, who taught my niece Fiona to draw perfect letters in the sand with sticks. You are the brave woman who chose to be free instead of safe. And I will never be the person who imprisons you again after witnessing the beauty of your freedom." In that transformative moment, with his calloused but gentle hands touching her face with infinite tenderness, and the relentless desert wind carrying away the fragments of her old identity as symbols of a life that no longer belonged to her, Layla understood with crystal clarity that she had found something infinitely more precious than individual freedom. She had found someone who not only valued her courageous choice to be free, but was willing to protect that freedom even at significant personal risk. But the reality of the outside world has a particularly cruel way of intruding on moments of happiness and emotional clarity, especially when it comes to people with the power and determination of Arthur Sterling. 2 days after the symbolic destruction of the newspaper, the distinct sound of powerful vehicle engines rapidly approaching broke the morning peace of the camp like stones thrown into a calm lake. Malachi and his most trusted men positioned themselves defensively at the traditional entrance of the camp, while 3 white Toyota Land Cruiser Jeeps stopped in a dense cloud of dust that temporarily covered everything with a thin layer of sand. Armed men in civilian uniforms, but carrying weapons that clearly identified their profession, dismounted from the vehicles with coordinated and professional movements. Led by a commander Layla recognized instantly through a discreet opening in the tent where she was hidden as Henry Vance, her father's head of personal security, a former military man with a reputation for never failing on important missions. Her blood literally ran cold when she saw him approach Malachi with an official paper in hand, and an expression that would tolerate no lies or evasions. "We are looking for this woman," Henry said in formal English, showing another enlarged, high-quality copy of Layla's professional photo. Reliable information obtained through multiple sources suggests she may have passed through this region in recent days. "Have you seen her? Or do you have any information about her whereabouts?" Layla was hidden in the women's tent, along with Mom Sadie and several other women of the community who instinctively protected her without asking questions. Observing through a carefully positioned opening in the fabric, she saw Malachi study the photograph with a completely neutral and uninterested expression, as if he had never seen that face before in his life, demonstrating impressive self-control considering the circumstances. "No," he replied with a firm, authoritative voice that brooked no questioning. "No woman of that type or description has passed through our camp. I'm absolutely certain of it." "Are you completely sure?" "Her family is offering a very generous reward for information leading to her safe recovery. Enough money to buy entire herds of camels and goats to comfortably establish your community for years." Henry was clearly trying to use financial incentives to encourage cooperation. "I am absolutely sure," Malachi repeated without hesitation, returning the photograph with a gesture that indicated a complete lack of interest. "If a woman of such distinct appearance had passed through our camp, I would definitely remember. We have no need for money that comes from betraying the trust of innocent travelers." Henry was obviously not entirely convinced by the denial, but as a man experienced in security operations, he knew he couldn't do much more than accept the word of a respected community leader without concrete evidence of a lie. After superficially but systematically searching the camp and asking a few additional questions to other members of the community, who all unanimously denied having seen any outsiders in recent weeks, the security men finally departed, but not without making it clear that they would return if new information emerged. When the sound of the engines finally disappeared completely in the distance and the dust cloud settled, Layla emerged from the tent and went directly to Malachi, who remained motionless exactly where Henry had left him, looking in the direction the vehicles had disappeared. "You consciously lied for my sake," she said, still barely able to believe what she had witnessed and the implications of what he had done. "I lied to protect a valuable member of my community," he corrected carefully, "and to preserve the principles of hospitality that define who we are as people." After a significant pause, he added more quietly, almost as if confessing something he shouldn't, "and also to protect someone who has become deeply important to me personally." It was the most direct and vulnerable confession of his feelings he had made, and Layla felt her heart race dramatically, at the same time that a genuine concern for his safety and that of his community began to dominate her thoughts. "They will inevitably return," she said with conviction based on intimate knowledge of her father's methods. "And when they return, they will be more suspicious and prepared. Henry is extremely competent and persistent. He doesn't give up easily when he has an important mission. You are risking your reputation as a leader, the safety of your entire community, your relations with other groups, and possibly governmental authorities. Then perhaps the time has come for you to leave for a safer place," he interrupted, but the evident pain in his voice completely contradicted his practical words. They stood looking at each other in absolute silence for a moment that stretched indefinitely, both understanding with painful clarity that they had reached an inevitable crossroads that would define not only their immediate future, but potentially the rest of their lives. To stay meant putting dozens of innocent people at risk of retribution for protecting a fugitive. To leave meant abandoning not only the only true happiness Layla had known, but also abandoning the man who had become the center of her emotional world. "I don't want to leave this place, or these people who have become my family," she admitted finally, with an honesty that left her completely vulnerable. "And I don't want you to leave and take with you the light you brought into our lives," he replied, taking a step toward her that lessened the physical distance but seemed to increase the emotional tension between them. "But sometimes, what we desperately want and what we responsibly must do are diametrically opposed things that cannot be reconciled." That night, after all members of the community had gone to sleep and the camp had settled into the respectful silence that precedes slumber, Malachi sought Layla near the spring where they had shared so many transformative conversations. She was already there, waiting, knowing instinctively that he would come and that this would likely be their last conversation before a separation that both knew was necessary but heartbreaking. "I know a man in Tucson, Arizona, a discreet and reliable merchant named Owen Thompson, who can help you get completely new documents and a different identity that will allow you to start over anywhere you choose," he said, the words coming out with difficulty, as if each syllable cost years of his life. You could become anyone, live any life you wish to build. And you? What will happen to you when I disappear from your life? She asked, though her heart already knew the answer would be painful. Malachi looked at the infinite stars before replying as if he were seeking wisdom in the constellations that had guided his people through centuries of migration and change. I will go back to being what I always was before you appeared like a miracle in our lives. The leader of the Stone River community, responsible solely for their well-being and safety, living each day according to the needs of my people. Is that really all you are? She asked, taking a step closer and forcing him to look directly into her eyes. Just responsibility and duty, with no room for personal happiness or emotional fulfillment. It was all I was before, he corrected carefully, looking into her eyes with an intensity that made her feel as if she were seeing directly into his soul. Until you arrived and showed me that there are other ways to live, other ways to find meaning and purpose. The confession hung in the air between them, like something tangible and precious, laden with all the feelings that had grown silently during weeks of respectful coexistence and mutual admiration. Layla felt all the carefully constructed barriers around her heart crumbling simultaneously, leaving her exposed and vulnerable, but also more alive than she had ever remembered being. Here was a man who was genuinely willing to sacrifice his own happiness to keep her safe and free, who had literally risked everything to protect her from consequences she had brought into his life, who could see her not as the daughter of someone important or a problem to be solved, but simply as an extraordinary woman worthy of love and protection. "Malachi," she began, but he gently shook his head to interrupt whatever she was about to say. "Please, don't make this separation harder than it already is," he pleaded with a voice that showed exactly how difficult this decision was for him. "You deserve a life where you can make your own choices without fear, where you never have to hide or live with a false identity, where you can use all your talents and intelligence without limitations imposed by circumstances. I cannot offer that to you here, not while your family is actively looking and willing to use any method necessary to find you. What if I said I don't want a life without you in it?" The question escaped before she could stop it, carrying all the vulnerability and desire she had tried to keep hidden. The silence that followed was laden with everything they couldn't openly say, everything they couldn't have in the current circumstances, all the alternative futures they might have explored if the world were different. Finally, Malachi extended his hand with a slow, deliberate movement and touched her face with infinite tenderness, his thumb gently tracing the line of her cheek as his eyes memorized every detail of her expression. "Then you will understand why this is the hardest decision I have ever had to make in my entire life," he said, his voice husky with emotion he was struggling to control, "and why this is the most painful gift I have ever had to give to someone I love." The word love hung suspended between them, like a final confession that changed everything and nothing simultaneously. It confirmed what both had felt growing for weeks, but also precisely underlined why separation was necessary. The next morning, Malachi personally prepared a small but well-equipped caravan to safely take her to Tucson. He carefully chose his 3 most trusted men, who had proven absolute loyalty during years of service, and provided more than sufficient supplies for the multi-day journey through potentially dangerous territory. When everything was meticulously prepared and the horses were ready to depart, the entire community gathered spontaneously to say goodbye, demonstrating how much she had become cherished and respected during her relatively brief stay. The children she had taught brought colorful drawings they had made especially for her, childlike artworks that showed her teaching, her smiling, her as part of the community family. The women gave her simple but beautifully crafted jewelry made with their own hands, silver bracelets, earrings with desert stones, a necklace with a small crescent moon pendant symbolizing protection during travels. The men nodded respectfully, formally thanking her for everything she had done for the children's education and expressing hopes that she would be protected on whatever path she chose to follow. Malachi was deliberately the last to say goodbye, and they carefully maintained an appropriate physical distance, fully aware that the entire community was watching them and that any inappropriate display of intimacy could create problems for him after her departure. But his eyes communicated volumes that words could never adequately express. "Always remember who you truly are," he said, handing her a small, soft leather pouch crafted with traditional geometric patterns. Not Layla Sterling, daughter of someone powerful and important, but simply Layla, the extraordinary woman brave enough to choose her own life when it would have been so much easier to accept what others decided for you. Inside the pouch were enough gold coins to comfortably establish a new life anywhere she chose, and also a small, smooth, perfectly polished desert stone that fit in the palm of her hand. When she questioned him about the stone with a curious look, he explained with a sad smile, "So you always remember that the desert can be the cruelest and most merciless place on earth, but it can also be where we find our true inner strength and discover capabilities we never knew we possessed." The journey to Tucson took 4 full days of riding through landscapes that alternated between stunning beauty and absolute desolation. Throughout the trip, Layla found herself looking back repeatedly, half expecting to see Malachi riding behind them, coming to get her because he had changed his mind about the separation. But he never appeared, and gradually she understood and accepted that his decision had been final and irrevocable from the moment he made it. In Tucson, Owen Thompson, Malachi's merchant friend, proved to be a discreet and extraordinarily efficient man who asked few questions and demonstrated impressive competence in matters that were clearly not new to him. In exactly 1 week, Layla Sterling officially ceased to exist in any accessible record, completely replaced by Nora Hayes, a young orphan teacher of modest origin seeking educational work anywhere she could make a positive difference. With the impeccably forged new documents and the generous money Malachi had provided, she traveled to Mexico City, where she found employment in a school for Central American refugee children who had lost years of education due to civil unrest in their home countries. It was challenging and emotionally demanding work, dealing with traumatized children who had seen horrors no child should witness. But it was also deeply rewarding in ways she had never anticipated. For the first time in her life, she was absolutely certain that she was doing exactly what she was meant to be doing, using her talents and privileged education to make a real difference in the lives of people who genuinely needed help. Months passed with deliberate slowness as Nora Hayes carefully built a simple but deeply satisfying life. She had a small apartment in a modest neighborhood near the school, decorated with functional simplicity but warmed by small personal touches. She developed genuine friendships with co-workers who became the chosen family she had never had. She found daily satisfaction in the gradual progress of children who slowly overcame traumas and rediscovered joy in learning. But no matter how consciously she tried to focus on the present and build an independent future, her heart stubbornly remained at the desert camp, with the man who had chosen her freedom over his own happiness. One spring night, almost exactly a year after her arrival in Mexico City, Nora was returning from school after a parent-teacher meeting that had run late when she saw a familiar figure standing in the softly lit central plaza. The man wore modern Western clothes, an elegant dark suit that made him look like an international businessman on a trip. But there was something unmistakable in his posture, in the way he observed the movement around him with genuine interest but natural detachment that made her stop abruptly and look more closely. It was unequivocally Malachi. He wasn't wearing traditional desert attire, but rather clothes that would help him blend in any cosmopolitan city. But she would recognize those deep, dark eyes anywhere. That way of carrying his head like someone accustomed to authority, but who never forgot his essential humanity. That particular way of observing the world with intelligent interest and genuine compassion. For a moment that seemed to stretch for an eternity, they just looked at each other across the crowd of people walking between them, each trying to determine if what they were seeing was real or a projection of desperate desires. Then, slowly and with deliberate movements, he began to walk toward her, navigating through the crowd with natural grace. When they finally met in the middle of the plaza, surrounded by the sound of conversations in Spanish and English and distant traffic, neither knew exactly what to say first. "How did you find me?" was the first question she managed to articulate, her voice mixing surprise, joy, and an instinctive concern that his presence there might mean trouble. "Owen told me you were well established here, that you had found significant work as a teacher," he replied, his hands in his pockets, as if he didn't quite know what to do with them in the absence of the traditional formalities that had always governed their interactions. "I needed to see with my own eyes that you were truly safe and happy. And your community, how are they? Were there consequences for protecting me?" "They are completely safe and thriving," he replied with a smile that immediately eased her worries. "Your father's men stopped actively looking approximately 6 months ago. Apparently, the family quietly but officially announced that you died in a tragic car accident in the desert, a victim of circumstances and the merciless vastness of nature." The irony of the situation was not lost on either of them, and both smiled simultaneously for the first time since their reunion. Layla Sterling had indeed died in the desert, not physically, but symbolically and socially. And from her ashes, Nora Hayes, a woman completely free to make her own choices and live her own life, had been born. "Why did you come here?" she asked. "Did you?" Though her heart was already beginning to hope for an answer she barely dared to imagine. "Because I discovered, through a whole year of reflection, that a leader without his most important person isn't really an effective one," he said, taking a step closer. "Because my community is thriving under new leadership, but I personally couldn't find peace or purpose without you. Because I spent almost an entire year wondering if I made the right decision by letting you go, and finally came to a definitive conclusion." "And what was that conclusion?" she asked, her heart pounding so hard she feared he could hear it. "That I made the absolutely right decision at that time, considering the circumstances and the risks involved. But that the circumstances have fundamentally changed," he explained, with the seriousness of someone who had carefully thought about every word. "You are safe now, established with a new identity and your own completely independent life. And I discovered that I voluntarily stepped down from leadership in favor of my cousin Alex, who was more than ready and is infinitely more suited to the modern challenges our community faces." She looked at him with genuine surprise. "You left your position as leader?" "I left my position, but not my responsibilities to the people I love," he corrected. "Alex is younger, more connected with contemporary issues, more adept with technology and modern business. Under his leadership, the community is thriving in ways I never could achieve. They not only survived my departure, they flourished." "But that was always your life, your identity, your reason for being," she began, still trying to fully process the implications of what he was saying. "My life is where you are," he said simply, with an absolute conviction that brooked no questioning. "And my identity is now defined not by inherited position, but by conscious choices. I would like to know if there is room in this new life you've built for someone who could never forget you and who is finally free to make his own choices." Nora's heart pounded with a force that threatened to break her ribs. For months she had dreamed impossibly of this moment. But now that it was actually happening, she felt a complex mixture of overwhelming joy and genuine concern for the implications of his decision. "My life here is very simple compared to what you're used to," she said carefully. "There are no luxuries, no high social status, no power or political influence. Just hard work and the personal satisfaction of helping traumatized children learn and recover." "That is exactly the life I want to live," he replied without the slightest hesitation. "Owen told me in detail about the transformative work you are doing here, how you are literally saving and rebuilding young lives that have been shattered by conflict. Is there room in this school for another teacher with international experience and a genuine passion for education?" It was then that she fully understood that he hadn't come to get her to take her back to the desert or to any life he had planned. He had come to join her in the life she had built independently, willing to completely abandon his previous identity to become part of the future she was creating. "Would you really leave everything you've ever known to stay here with me?" she asked, still struggling to believe the reality of what was happening. "I already have," he said simply. "The question now is whether you will accept me as I am now, not as a leader, but simply as Malachi, a man who wants to dedicate the rest of his life to you and to the meaningful work you both can do together." The tears Nora had held back for so many months of longing finally came. But now they were tears of pure joy instead of pain or loss. Here was the man who had respected her need for freedom enough to let her go when it was necessary, but who also loved her enough to find a way to be with her when circumstances finally allowed. "Yes," she whispered, and then repeated louder with growing conviction, "Yes, yes, yes, more than anything in the world." When Malachi kissed her there in the middle of the brightly lit plaza of Mexico City, with the sound of the city continuing around them and the aroma of street food wafting from nearby restaurants, Nora felt that she had finally found her true place in the universe. It wasn't in her father's mansion with its suffocating rules, nor even in the enchanted desert camp with its seductive simplicity, but in that space they would create together, built on free choices, true love, and mutual commitment to something greater than themselves. 3 years later, Professor Malachi Stone and Professor Nora Hayes were known and respected throughout the district for their exceptional and innovative work with refugee children from multiple countries who had arrived in Mexico City carrying unimaginable traumas, but also impressive determination to rebuild their lives. They had married in a simple but deeply meaningful civil ceremony with only a few close co-workers as witnesses, but the love between them was obvious and inspiring to anyone who knew them. Malachi discovered that teaching gave him exactly the same sense of high purpose and personal fulfillment that leading his community had provided, but with the additional and transformative freedom of making that choice consciously for himself instead of simply fulfilling inherited obligations. Nora, in turn, found in partnership with him a way to exponentially multiply her impact. Together, they could reach and transform many more children and families than either could alone, combining their different types of experience and knowledge. On an especially warm summer afternoon, as they methodically organized teaching materials for the first day of the new school year, Nora found the small, polished desert stone Malachi had given her years earlier as a memento of their farewell. She always kept it on her desk as a decorative paperweight, but that day she really looked at it and held it for the first time in many months. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked, showing him the smooth stone. "Regret what, exactly?" he replied, stopping organizing books to give her his full attention. Leaving the desert, abandoning your traditional position, choosing this simple urban life instead of the tribal leadership life that was always yours. Malachi completely stopped what he was doing and looked at her with that soft, deeply affectionate smile she had learned to love unconditionally over the years. "The desert isn't fundamentally a physical place," he said, carefully taking the stone from her hands. "It's a mental and spiritual state. It's about being strong enough to survive and thrive in challenging conditions, about finding beauty and meaning where others see only difficulties and limitations, about valuing the simple and genuine things that truly matter for human happiness." He placed the stone back on her desk and took both her hands in his with infinite tenderness. "I didn't leave the desert behind, Nora. I brought its most important values and lessons with me and built an oasis here with you, a place where we can flourish together while helping others discover their own inner strength." That night, as they walked hand in hand down the familiar street that led them home, passing small shops where the owners greeted them warmly and children played on the sidewalks, Nora thought of her mother and the prescient letter she had found so many years ago. Francis Sterling had written eloquently about the invaluable worth of personal freedom, but Nora had discovered through lived experience something even deeper and more transformative. That true freedom is not simply about fleeing all responsibilities and obligations, but about consciously and deliberately choosing which responsibilities to embrace and with whom to share life's journey. She had courageously fled an imposed marriage that represented a lifetime of choices made by others and discovered through adventures that almost cost her life the true love she never knew existed. She had rejected an existence of empty material luxury and found deep and lasting satisfaction in meaningful work that touched and transformed real lives. She had left behind a name and identity she never truly chose, and created a new identity that was authentically her own creation. Most importantly of all, she had learned through painful experience and eventual triumph that sometimes the greatest act of courage is not to depart in search of the unknown, but to stay and fight for something worth preserving. It is not to reject love because it is complicated or challenging, but to accept it precisely because it is real and transformative. It is not to flee from all commitments, but to consciously choose with whom and for what to commit with all one's heart. The desert had been simultaneously her cruelest and most generous teacher, almost killing her with its relentless indifference, but also giving her not only the freedom she desperately sought, but the love she didn't even know she needed to become complete. And now, living a simple but rich life in a foreign city, she carried within her both the resilient strength of the desert and the nurturing softness of true love, knowing with absolute certainty that she had finally found not only her place in the world, but her true identity as a complete human being. Years later, when their own children asked with childlike curiosity about how their parents met and fell in love, Nora and Malachi always told the story slightly differently, depending on the children's ages and the circumstances, but always with the same hopeful and inspiring ending, that sometimes destiny consciously leads us through the most difficult and seemingly impossible paths to deliver exactly what we need to flourish, but only at the moment we are finally ready to properly receive and value these precious gifts. And on the clearest, most starry nights, when they went for a walk under the infinite sky of Mexico City that strangely reminded them of the desert nights where they met, Nora could still smell the familiar and comforting scent of the desert in the night wind and remember with deep gratitude the brave and determined woman she once was, the woman who consciously chose to be free and, in making that difficult but necessary choice, found not only the personal freedom she sought, but also the true love that transformed that freedom into something complete and eternally satisfying. The desert had been her most demanding and most generous teacher, teaching her the most valuable lesson possible, that true strength does not come from surviving life's storms alone, but from finding someone extraordinary with whom it is worth sharing both the inevitable storms and the precious oases that make the human journey not just bearable, but genuinely beautiful and meaningful. Dear listeners, we hope this story has touched your heart. If you were moved, please like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments what stood out to you most. Every day, we bring real stories full of emotion and humanity. Your voice is part of this universe.